current crisis in the opposition movement in Zimbabwe. But this is more than that. We're looking at really the crisis in our politics in Zimbabwe. The backdrop is very, very simple. We have a very peculiar situation in Zimbabwe, where ever since independence, opposition parties have been regarded as enemies, whether it was Joshua Nkomo at Tapu, Edgar Tikere Morgan Tsvangirai and MDC, and now Triple C under Chamisa. And this is a very strange, if not also curious, situation that we have, very unusual. I can't think of any other country in the region which has a similar kind of experience. It has to do with the nature of nationalist protest in Zimbabwe and its demand for conformity and its intolerance for dissent, opposition. It goes back right to the divisions in nationalist movement in ZANU formed outside ZAPU, and indeed the conflict that we have seen between ZAPU and ZANU, especially in exile. And we have seen this persistence of this intolerance for the opposition. Secondly, we have also seen a conventional opposition which is not so much as an objective to take over and transform and change and have an alternative policy framework. It's simply, indeed, the quest to take over power, and in many cases to do exactly as the ruling parties of the day. And indeed, African politics being what they are, our parties, political parties, so-called, are less parties than platforms on the basis of which, for elections, to win power, they have one power to retain power forever. And that's where we are. The Zimbabwe situation, we have a situation where the state party conflation has meant a defiance against any opposition. Whereas in most of post-colonial Africa, 10, 15 years after which the ruling party is overtaken, whether in Zambia, UNEP, overtaken 1991, Malawi Congress Party, and so on and so forth. And here we have a very peculiar situation where the conflation of party and state, and the backdrop of militarism, right through from the days of liberation struggle to the present, has been a major factor in the extent to which ZANU-PF has retained power. And as I said just now, the opposition seems not so far not been able to dislodge ZANU-PF. And it is really our task today to look at the nature and content of the opposition politics. We know that the opposition movement since 1999, in particular, the formation of the MDC, that the conventional model of confronting ZANU-PF has failed, and especially given the 2000 situation, in which inadvertently or by design, the opposition received massive support from white Zimbabweans, many of whom had lost their farms in the fast-track land reform of 2000. And that, in many ways, played into the hands of the ruling party. And indeed, it highlighted the theme or the belief or the perception that the opposition in Zimbabwe was supported by former colonialists, supported by the former colonial power of Britain, and so on and so forth. And this theme has tended to justify on the part of ZANU-PF the retention of power and indeed almost the disqualification or outlawing of the opposition. The plight of the opposition has been exacerbated by the economic decline as well, which has seen Zimbabweans flocking out of the country. We have now 4 to 5 million Zimbabweans outside the country, and including a large chunk of the educated class, where more than 75% of professional and skilled Zimbabweans are now outside the country. And this has depleted all sectors of society, not least the opposition. And one would want to say that both in the ruling and opposition parties, we have done the best of Zimbabweans in those corridors. And the diaspora factor has become a major feature of our politics, and to the extent that both the ruling party and the opposition have ignored the diaspora has been to the detriment of the country. In addition to the militarization of the state that we have referred to, we have a situation where ZANU-PF and the state have been able to exercise a level of patronage, demonstrated as it has in the last few months, to the extent to which MPs were paid 40,000 each, the judiciary 400,000 each, the judges, and the extent to which right now the CCC has been confronted with the force of patronage. The scale of recalls, never had anything like that in our lives. Recalls, by-elections, almost complete annihilation of the opposition. And so while we discuss the nature and content of our opposition, we need to bear in mind that the question is not so much about the opposition, but about the nature of the state and the ZANU-PF state conflation, and the extent to which, as I said earlier, this state party conflation is intolerant of the opposition. It treats the opposition as an enemy to be vanquished. And what we have right now is almost a near vanquishing of the entire opposition. So on that note, I want to introduce my panelists. We have Hopeful Chingono, Blessed Mshlanga, two prominent journalists. We've chosen them for this session because they have been the most prominent in terms of the interaction with our politics in general, but also with the opposition. They have a store of knowledge about the opposition, and they will help us unpack the causes of the current malaise in the opposition. Then we have Brighton Mutebuka, a lawyer based in the diaspora, a man who has been very busy on the social media and on X, or former Twitter, and he's one of the most knowledgeable about the goings on in CCC. To assist us, we have a batch of discussants. We have Julius Maurire, a very serious commentator, on the politics in our country. Chennai Mtambesere in the diaspora also has graced our platform a number of times. And Chipodendere, a scholar, currently based in Cape Town, but otherwise in the US. And Jackie Sunday of the Xavier Kasikwere connection, so to speak. So I'll begin with Hopewell, and then on to Blessed in Brighton. And then the format I'm going to follow today is not that to allow our panelists to speak at length, but to interrogate each after a brief statement, try and highlight the main issues that they're trying to bring across. Hopewell, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mandaza. It's quite difficult to speak about Zimbabwean politics to a historian and political scientist of your stature, but I'll try my level best. I think I want to start on the fact that we are all Zimbabweans. There are certain things that take place in our homes, whether it's our personal homes or our political homes, which are called political parties. But when you go into those homes, there is a certain element of Zimbabweanness that you will always see regardless of whose home it is, whether it's Hopewell's home or Dr. Mandaza's home, or whether it's ZANU-PF or Triple C or MDC. You see these things all the time. And so it starts with how we elect our leaders or how we select our leaders. In post-colonial history of this country, of Zimbabwe, that element has always been problematic. I mean, I can go back even to the 70s. Professor Mandaza has spoken at length in terms of the emergence of people like Robert Mugabe becoming president of ZANU-PF in Chimoyi in 1977. And all the way right up to where we are today. So the MDC was a creation, the original MDC was a creation that came about because there was a political crisis that was manifesting itself through economics. We know that the dollar had crashed post-1997. We had the DRC war, and then we were faced with an imminent land reform, land seizures that took place, which became violent. And that is how the MDC came into being, because it was meant to address the economic crisis that was taking place in Zimbabwe at that time. So one would argue that the MDC, or the opposition in Zimbabwe, has gotten a lot of votes, not on the basis of ideology or anything else, but on the basis of the suffering of the people. People are saying they want the economic situation addressed. It seems someone has got their mic on. So that is how it came into being. And Morgan Tsvangirai led the MDC, wildly popular at the time. And I think it was 2002 when we had a situation where the military pronounced itself for the first time in words by saying that they will not salute anyone who doesn't have a liberation history. And of course, we all know that they were referring to Morgan Tsvangirai. The military was a factor in the sense that ZANU-PF is a political party which had a military. When we came into our independence, ZANU-PF came with its military, ZAPU came with its military, ZIPRA and ZANU, ZANLA, and the Rhodesians had their own army. These three armies were put together, and we ended up with a military that was more like a political commissar for a political party, because the commanders of that military were also sitting in the Politburo, from Rex Nongo right up to where we are, where the president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, attempted to bring in the commander of the military, General Sibanda. And so with this, it became a well-pronounced fight between the establishment and the opposition. And the establishment, of course, had state institutions to use. It has a military it had the military to use. We remember how the judiciary was dismantled and so forth. And the first test for the opposition was in 2005, because the opposition was meant to address the democratic deficit that was in Zimbabwe. And this was an opportunity, I guess, for the opposition to show that they were really democratic. I must say this before I get into the 2005 split, that Zimbabweans by nature, although they don't want to accept it, they follow individuals and personalities and not ideas and ideology. So you saw that well pronounced in 2005, where there was a constitution in black and white, which stated that if you don't win a vote, the majority goes. And Morgan Tsvangirai refused to accept the majority position in regards to the senatorial elections. And that's when we saw the first split. And democracy suffered. And ZANU-PF took advantage of this, because it became difficult to talk about constitutionalism when you are not practicing constitutionalism in your own political party. But because, as I said earlier, the opposition came into being because of a political crisis manifesting itself through economics, the citizens were willing to overlook that. And those issues have never been primary or central to debates in homesteads, whether someone has broken the constitution or not. As long as we like that person, breaking the constitution doesn't matter. And this is no different to ZANU-PF, where constitutions have been broken before so many times and had been broken before 2005. I'll give an example which Professor Mundaza is well familiar with. In 1984, at the Borodale Racecourse ZANU-PF Congress, the senior minister for political affairs at the time, Mr. Nyagumbo, won the position of deputy president in ZANU-PF. But Mugabe intervened to stop Nyagumbo becoming the vice president of the party and subsequently of the country, because he said, no, you can't do that to Mzenda. So these things are prominent in our history, where leaders intervene so that certain outcomes prevail over the majority. So what happened in 2005, it is Zimbabweanness in it, in that it had happened before. When this happened, the majority of the citizens, as I said, went with Morgan Tsvangirai breaking the constitution, because this is self-evident in the subsequent election results, because they were pursuing one goal. The one goal is that we want to get rid of ZANU-PF. So the hatred for ZANU-PF has attracted all manner of people who are not necessarily democratic, but want to see the back of ZANU-PF. And I've always joked that, not wanting ZANU-PF does not necessarily make you a Democrat. It simply means that you want ZANU-PF to go. And as Professor Mandaza said in the introduction, we have a history of such political parties or behavior in Africa, where they come in and they do the same thing as the previous ruling party was doing. So the critics of Morgan Tsvangirai were accused of being ZANU-PF, and they were accused of being CIO. They were accused of being sellout. The same language that we see from the liberation struggle, the language that was used to get people killed, had found its way in the opposition discourse. So you found people like Trudy Stevenson, they were beaten up. Again, another Zimbabwean trait where you settle political arguments with violence. So the opposition was proving that it was not necessarily different in so many ways to ZANU-PF. it just wanted to get ZANU-PF out of the way, because as citizens, we've always wanted ZANU-PF to go because of corrupt rule and so many things that were taking place. And after this split, we saw the emergence, or the pronounced emergence, of a kitchen cabinet, which was accountable to Morgan Tsvangirai and nobody else, where decisions were made outside the structures of the Movement for Democratic Change. Then it was now called Movement for Democratic Change, Tsvangirai, MDCT. And we saw Tsvangirai starting to recruit people who were compromised, people he was warned about at the time, people like James Maridadi, but he didn't listen, again, because the leader had so much power. He was able to do as he thought was right and good for the political party. And if you opposed him, you became a sellout. You became a CIO, a ZANU-PF agent within the political party. And then we went into the GNU after the violence, unnecessary violence that had taken place against Morgan Tsvangirai and his lieutenants, including people like Professor Blavmo Maduku. Again, this election was fraught with that Zimbabweanness of violence. People had their homes burnt down, and we ended up with a GNU. During this GNU, that's when I realized the hand of the state in counterintelligence, because Morgan was lied to. He was told that they want to kill you. And then he flew to I think it was first to South Africa, then to Botswana, where he stayed there. And yet what the regime wanted was him out of the way, because they were afraid that if there is a figure that people can converge around, there could be a revolution of sorts, or an uprising against the fake election results that had been put out. We all know after Mugabe then pronounced months later that Morgan actually won the election by 73%. But that's now a historical factor. But we also saw during that time a component of ethnic politics taking place, not just in ZANU-PF, but also in the MDC. And there was an attempt to get rid of Tendai Biti as finance minister. I hope those that will write books will document what actually happened. And of course, ZANU-PF realized this, and it took advantage of it, and it started creating cracks. There was also an element of that Zimbabwean component I was talking about, where the opposition itself became too relaxed in this unholy alliance called the GNU. Some were involved in corruption. I remember Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai getting rid of Elias Mzuri because he was said to have been involved in fuel deals when he was energy minister. So we saw that element of Zimbabweanness, where when people get power, they start to use power to accumulate personal wealth for themselves. And then, of course, we came to the 2013 election, with which I know Dr. Mandaza, you're very familiar with. The details that I'm going to say, some of them happened when you were there in Maputo, where the opposition was told not to take part, advised not to take part in the election of 2013, but they did not listen to the advice that was coming from SADC voices, including President Zuma. This, I have it on the record. The point person who was running all these things for President Zuma confirmed it. And Professor Mandaza, you were there in Maputo where these things took place. And for the first time, as documented by one of Zimbabwe's renowned scholars, Dr. Chamisa, we saw the hand of God, where Prime Minister Tsvangirai openly said, I've been informed that, God has touched my head, and that I'm going to win this election. So he went into an election on the premise, one of his lieutenants told him that God had said that, spoken to him that he was going to to win the election. Of course, we know what happened. The election was rigged. Up to now, we don't even know how it was rigged. When I ask the opposition, they don't know how it was rigged. So it was time to regroup for the opposition. 2014, I think it was 2014, there was a Congress. We saw that Zimbabwean element again, now rigging elections, bringing in people that you want and getting rid of those that you don't want. Morgan Tsvangirai did not want Nelson Chamisa to become the Secretary General of the Movement for Democratic Change, Tsvangirai faction. And the reason was that he had been told that, oh, this young man will topple you. And this is not different from what people like Mugabe were being told in the past about people that were seen as popular and in some cases seen as more competent than President Mugabe, and you would get rid of them. So that's how Monzora became Secretary General. Morgan Tsvangirai, I think the election was rigged in order to stop Nelson Chamisa and allow Monzora to come in, and Monzora became the Secretary General. But before that, there had been a fight, a discourse fight around change of leadership. And people like BT, Elton Mangoma wanted Morgan Tsvangirai to now present his plan for stepping down. But of course, Morgan Tsvangirai was not prepared for that. And we saw that BT and Mangoma had to leave the MDCT. I've been seeing some of the videos this week when they were being used to demonize Tendai BT as a traitor. Again, this is another Zimbabwean element. If I disagree with you, Professor Mandaza, I can call you a traitor. And if I have got a lot of supporters behind me, they will sing that song until it becomes real. And it's very unfortunate because this is the language that has been part of our political discourse from the 50s, where people like Joshua Ngomo were called traitors. People like Ndabaning Stole were called traitors. The very people that called them traitors declared Ndabaning Stole a national hero. When Ngomo was called a traitor, a snake that must have its head hit, again, the same people who called him a traitor declared him a national hero. And so we saw that, and we ended up with a situation where there was another split again. And then in 2015, there was illegal appointments that were made. But because they were made by a popular leader within the opposition, again, supporters said, no, what Save said must go. But I think I need to come back and address these appointments and give the listeners a certain nuance. The military has always been involved in politics in Zimbabwe, and even in post-2000 politics. A general went to see Morgan Tsvangirai and said, look, you're not feeling well. Your party is a very important institution in this country. Now, if anything happens to you, I'm not saying something is going to happen to you, but if anything happens to you, this party will now be taken over by a Ndebele woman. We cannot allow that to happen. You need to appoint someone. That's how Nelson Chamisa and Mdzuri were appointed. Again, there were tensions in the party because there was an ethnic element in that. Morgan Tsvangirai was Karanga, Nelson was Karanga, Mdzuri was Karanga. So essentially, the top of the party was being run by Karanga people, and there were people that were complaining in the party. But as with everything to do with Zimbabwe, people don't want to come out in the open and say, I'm not happy with this because of ethnic politics, because people just keep quiet and talk in hushed tones. A few people have been able to talk about the issue of the Zulu Karanga politics. One of them, Jealous, is going to speak. I hope you will speak into this because I've seen him addressing it on Twitter. So Chamisa was appointed, Mdzuri was appointed, And the one person I must give credit to who brought this, who discussed this element with me in depth, talking about this general, talking about what it means to Zimbabwean politics, was Dr. Pesero. And I remember one Saturday afternoon sitting at the Bronde after these appointments had been made, and Dr. Ruanya was explaining to me how he saw it. And we discussed it at length. And again, it would reappear later because the coup was now being planned. And the Lacoste faction realized that they needed people from the opposition to execute this coup. But there are differences. And I think this has been covered before by the actors. There are differences because Mnangagwa saw Changirai and his team as wanting more than they deserved, and this didn't go far. And one of the persons that was involved as an emissary between the two camps was Nelson Chamisa himself. So I hope when he writes his memos, he'll be able to talk a little bit more about this. And I think I'll leave it for now so that I give others an opportunity to flesh out the issues, and then I can come back.
Thanks, Hope. So in summary, what do you say are the current problems within the opposition? In summary,
I think there is no. We have discussed at length, Professor Mandaza, why we are in this mess. And the only answer that we seem to put on the table is ZANU-PF. Yes, ZANU-PF is the big problem in our country. But as actors who are opposed to corrupt rule, as actors who are opposed to the criminality that takes place under the ZANU-PF regime, we must also take ownership of our mistakes. And there's nothing special about ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF is no more draconian in its approach than other regimes that have been toppled in the past. But we need to accept and agree that there hasn't been democracy as it's said in the opposition. The rule of law has not been properly followed in the opposition. And the culture of personality politics from the days of Morgan Tsvangirai has always been the case. So if you say something, you will find that there's a team that is ready to attack you for exposing the weaknesses of Morgan Tsvangirai. That was before he died. And the same thing applies today. You actually have a group of journalists or a group of intellectuals in all these political parties. ZANU-PF at the Mahosos and the opposition personalities, not the party itself, but they support personalities. They've got their own group of journalists, group of intellectuals, group of supporters, social media influencers, who they use to influence how people see what's going on, the narratives, and so on. So I think there's no democracy, as we've seen that at every given time when there's the crisis in the opposition, it has been about the failure of democracy. Professor Brian Raftopoulos has written extensively on these issues. But as usual,
what about the Chamisa factor, which is more immediate? His resignation last week, sudden resignation. How do we explain that, and what are the implications thereof?
I think we saw this coming because, in my view, as I've made public in the past, and I've explained this to Nelson Chamisa himself, it's difficult to run a political party without structures. It's very difficult. And that's what Nelson Chamisa was attempting to do. And the irony is that he said he was doing it in order to stop infiltration. And he resigned, saying that, or rather quit, saying that he had done so because of the infiltration that had taken place in the political party. I think running a political party without proper organizational structures is challenging, and it hinders the effectiveness of that political party. And organizational structures provide a framework for decision making.
That's true, but what are the implications of the resignation, and what about this talk about the plan behind the release of Job Sikala when he was released? That there was a plan on part of the state to cause more confusion within the CCC. What's your comments on that?
I'm not sure about that because I don't have the evidence of what has been said. What I know for a fact is that Chamisa, at the moment, regardless of everything that has happened in the past, he is the best foot forward for the opposition. And the opposition should not be seen in the lenses of one man or a group of people. Everyone who's opposed to corrupt rule in Zimbabwe is part of the opposition. So if you need a figurehead to go out there and mobilize or take part in an election as a representative of the people's frustrations, I think Nelson Chamisa is the best foot forward that Zimbabwe has at the moment. The problem is that when the way he left the opposition movement in disarray, not just CCC, but even civil society, because again, regardless of how anyone can feel about Nelson Chamisa, he is the representative of the fight against ZANU-PF corrupt rule. And so at the moment, the opposition is demobilized. They are tearing each other apart. They're calling each other sellouts, and it doesn't help. And the only entity that is benefiting from what is happening at the moment, unfortunately, it is ZANU-PF, and it is exploiting it, and it is fueling it. And sometimes it really makes me upset because I see people who should know better fueling the same divisions, and ZANU-PF will come and throw something on social media to say, oh, BT is our guy. And then you find people that should know better running with that, saying, oh, BT is ZANU-PF has said BT is their guy, so BT is a sellout and so forth. There's no nuance into these thought processes because people have just become, they've been pitted against each other, and there's no time to reflect, and there's a tragic failure of leadership all round, not just in ZANU-PF, but across the board, in civil society, in the opposition. You didn't have this in 2000, 2005. You actually had leaders who would mobilize people, who would help us understand what was going on in proper terms. People like yourselves would have surface dialogue meetings where people would come and argue and still go and have a cup of tea or a glass of wine together. But nowadays, if I disagree with you, you become an enemy. I need to kill you. You are a sellout. You are ZANU-PF. And you can't have a normal society which is able to uproot a corrupt regime like ZANU-PF if those that are at the forefront of leading such a resistance are behaving in such a way.
We'll come back to that. We want to also consider the implications for ZANU-PF as well, for the mess that has been created in the recall, in the systematic demolition of the opposition. There must be some repercussions, surely. Let's move on now. Is Blessed in? Blessed has been trying to get in. We reached our maximum earlier on, and it was not as we thought you'd try and get in. Blessed, are you there? If you're not, we're moving to Brighton Mutebuka. Brighton? Brighton? Brighton, are you there? Is Brighton there? Okay, let's get Chipo. Come in, Chipo.
Okay, thank you for having me. Sorry, I missed submission.
Maybe you could begin by commenting on specifically on the Chamisa factor, the implications.
Okay.
The implication of resignation, the reasons thereof, and whether the opposition, whether Triple C, if you can look at that first.
Okay. So I wanted to start saying that part of this is the end tail of what people like Adrian Labat with regards to the politics that's deeply polarized. And at the founding, we see that you're either with us or you're against us. And there's a whole literature on why this was. So what we're seeing now, almost 20 years towards the end of the struggle, is the downside of polarization that would have been effective, right? So in 99, 2000, there were all these papers on why MDC is one of the best opposition parties on the continent, which had the best chances of taking out ZANU-PF. But if one of the strategies of one of their strengths rather was being able to create this clear delineation between them and ZANU-PF and say, either you are on our side, and if you're not on our side, then you're not on the side of the people. What that has meant is that with every single fracture that we've seen since 2005, that polarization becomes problematic internally. So in post-2023 elections, we get to the culmination of that. And the question is, who is with Nelson Chamisa and who isn't? And a lot of people interpret that as this is a Nelson Chamisa problem, whereas I think it's very much a Zimbabwe problem, right? It's how our politics have engineered themselves. So within ZANU-PF, there is a better way of controlling you're with us or you're against us, because the party is able to reward people, right? So if you're with ZANU-PF, you get financial rewards, and those financial rewards keep people tethered to the party. And if you leave the party, one of the punishments is that you lose these financial rewards. So you come to 2023 elections, and a leader in Zimbabwe and in Zimbabwean politics has to be able to firmly control the party and say, you are with me or you're not with me. And what has happened is that, Triple C is now a conglomeration, right? It's a conglomeration of individuals who had their own parties. They joined together in 2018. That didn't work out. But how do you keep people together where the rewards are not consistent? And for some of the people, right, in politics, the reward is financial gain. And if you don't have financial gain, then the reward is positionality. And Chamisa and those that support him were trying to move away from positionality, right? So moving away from a president, a vice president, a treasurer, all of this. And we can debate whether or not that was a good strategy, but that's what they were trying to move away from, thinking, okay, let's create, and we've seen those types of arrangements work in.
Chipo, you're a political scientist. Is it reasonable or prudent to
And I was going to answer that question and say we've seen that work in West Africa, right? We've seen it work in.
Can I just pose my question?
Oh, okay.
You seem to be defensive about a criticism which has been leveled against Chamisa, that in organizational terms, it was fatal to have tried to run a party without structures, without an organizational framework. What have you got to say on that? Where have you seen a party?
Well, I'm a political scientist, so I'm not defending them. What I'm saying is that there are different methodologies of doing this. And I can see why they would have borrowed something like that, which we've seen happen a lot in West Africa, right? Where you have pretty much independent candidates coalescing together. And what I've learned from some of the people that were closer to him is that they do take their lessons, right, from that. But in Zimbabwean context, that's problematic, because while Zimbabwean politics is very polarized, it's also very institutionalized. So I always take people back to the core and say, we are a country of rules. We like rules. We like things that make sense on paper. That's why our coup was unique in that they were trying to make it constitutional. And so a broad-based party that doesn't have those what we are discussing here as structures is very, very difficult. At the same time, they achieved something in 2023, right, which was to deny ZANU-PF the supermajority. Except the problem was, you achieve this, but if the other people that you're working with don't have some benefit, right? So they don't have the benefit of money. They don't have the benefit of being MPs. The only benefit that they really have with being in Triple C is being in positions. Wait, let me finish. Is being in positions. And so I think Nelson Chamisa wasn't listening to the pulse of the people that he was working with, but also the pulse of the politics that we have in Zimbabwe. So when you do that, right, and you deny people some benefit, and I'm not saying that these people are bad. Every single person goes into an organization, into something with the hope of some benefit, whatever that benefit is. And so this benefit wasn't there. And it did seem to other people that other people were getting benefits above them, right? So you're saying we're a party that doesn't really have positions, but how does Promise come in and be spokesperson? So that's bound to rub people the wrong way. But there were also serious problems in Matabeleland, right, that were not addressed pre-August 2023. So now you already have these fissures on many different angles. And ideally, they should have come together backdoor and figured out these fissures, especially the fissures in Matabeleland. I've been listening to a lot of people from Matabeleland who are saying, listen, there were issues in August, in June, in July. In Harare, we had the same issues, but the way of dealing with those issues in Harare is very different than in Matabeleland. I would talk to MP candidates for Triple C in Harare who would say, well, you know what, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know who's going to be candidate. We don't know whether I'm going to be on the ballot or not. But their loyalty to Chamisa, their loyalty to the opposition politics worked very, very differently. So if I were to think about how did we get to this resignation, I would say the root of it was that Nelson Chamisa didn't listen to the pulse of those small problems that then created room for something bigger. And if you're ZANU-PF, you're always waiting, right? And you're thinking, okay, how do these fissures help me? If you're ZANU-PF, you're thinking, well, we have Scott. Scott really wanted to be in parliament. Scott has a lot of money. Scott would be good for us in point X, Y, and Z. We don't really have people in Matabeleland that we're vying for very, very strongly, but we have this guy in Harare that we want to get in. So can we capitalize on that? And so then they capitalize on that. But these weaknesses that we're seeing in that we've seen in Triple C, again, their roots even go back to 2005. So a lot of people are treating this like this is something new. But I think Chamisa should have anticipated another fissure, right? He should have anticipated that the same exact thing that happened in 2018 would happen in 2023. And it would even be worse if you haven't given people positions that keep them rooted in the party. So you need to keep people rooted. You need people to have some sense of ownership. And to me, this became very clear last night when particular sects of the party immediately changed their Twitter bios to indicate the new positions that they have. So I think that the fact that people wanted positions is not light, and it's not something that we should dismiss. But positions also meant that it would keep people rooted, right? If I don't have money out of this political agreement, or maybe I don't need the money, but I get to be vice president, I get to be secretary general, I get to be treasurer, I get to be something. And I think that's the challenge with populists. So we're seeing a rise of populist candidates, and I think Chamisa falls in that framework of populists. And their downside is also their advantage, which is that they have these big, grandiose ideas of how change can be done. But those big, grandiose ideas have to work in a framework that already exists. And that's the challenge. Yes.
What now? Chamisa says,
what now? I think there are two options.
Let me finish my question. What now? What are the implications, not only for the Triple C, but national politics in general? Very briefly, please.
Very briefly, I think Zimbabweans have to go beyond the politics of individuals, right? But that's not going to happen overnight. That's something that takes a long time. What's clear to me is that none of the opposition leaders that remain have the power to get people out. So for that reason, Chamisa remains relevant. But it's also clear that Chamisa cannot make the journey alone. I don't think, from my analysis, from listening to all of these opposition people, I don't think that their differences are so big that they can't do what they did in 2017 when Morgan Tsvangirai called everybody and said, listen, we got to work together. But I think that comes from the citizens, and citizens saying to them, we know you've got issues, but your issues are not more important than the country. And if you want to continue to be in politics, we, the citizens, have to start holding you accountable. We have to hold you accountable because these recalls cost the life of somebody. And if citizens can't do that, can't say to politicians, you're squabbling from Chamisa to BT to Welshman to Wende, if citizens can't say to them, your squabbling cost the life of somebody, right? If citizens can't hold them accountable, then they will continue to squabble. They will continue to frail. They will continue to waste people's time, because that's exactly what happened. The time of citizens was wasted in August 2023. You and I remember being on a flight back from voting, talking about the hours we spent in line. And all of those hours have been wasted because our leaders haven't gotten it through their heads that they are accountable to the citizens. And perhaps the citizens, we have said, we are giving them too much room. So what happens going forward, and I really like the engagement that's happening online, is that citizens have to draw the line and say to you can't do this alone. When you're Welshman, you can't do this alone. And we are not going to allow you to, because you are wasting our time, unless you come out clearly and say, listen, we're forming 3 different parties. We've got 3 different ideologies. We each want to run our own party, and people have the right to choose whichever party they want. But if they're still going to do this back and forth of claiming one individual party, claiming one individual group of people, this is just wasting citizens' time. And I think citizens have to punish that kind of behavior. And we haven't seen Zimbabweans punish that kind of behavior. You see, our politicians wouldn't do what they're doing in South Africa. They just wouldn't do it. Tabango wouldn't have done what is done in South Africa. They wouldn't do this in West Africa. They wouldn't do this in East Africa, because the citizens would punish them. And we're not that kind of society, but I do think there has to be a way for citizens to do that.
We'll come back to that. Let me move now to Brighton Mutebuga. Brighton, are you there? Brighton?
Yes, I'm there, Prof.
Let me begin by just a question. One of the questions I have is really, it appears that someone did make a comment yesterday that by discussing the opposition, the manner in which we are doing so, we seem to have forgotten that there was a disputed election a few months ago.
Well, absolutely. For me, Prof, that's not a coincidence. I think we're looking at high-level state politics where the state is getting involved and contrived to distract and deflect all the attention that was centered on legitimacy and the electoral issues that arose from the sham election. And this is a well-known template that has been repeatedly used in the past for the same reasons. I think clearly what you said earlier about a militarized state, about intolerance, intolerance of dissent, this is the key to the current crisis. And my assessment of the situation is simply that in the past, at all material times, the post-independent states, I think starting even from the liberation struggle, there has been a consistent lack of tolerance of dissent and big politics, the use of state apparatus. You're looking at the liberation struggle, your Tungo Garas, people getting shot. You know very well about those gory incidents in the liberation struggle. Now, that was transferred into the independent state, and that independence the institutions that were set up or inherited from the regions together with that machinery was consistently used to make sure that the state would reign supreme and the party-state conflation would continue. And now, in this electoral cycle, we are at a moment in time in which the state or ZANU-PF hegemony was threatened, following the Sham election. And given the movements that were happening in SADC, it was clear that something had to give. That is at least my interpretation of the situation. And what then transpired is that the state then contrived to make sure that the legitimacy that Chamisa had and CCC via the electoral performance had to be destroyed in order to defeat the CM process and SADC processes related to resolving the Zimbabwean crisis. And by doing, by adopting that strategy, it meant two things. Number one, it meant that ultimately they would also be destroying the opposition at home. And number two, with that opposition destroyed, it meant that there could not be a basis to push forward with the CM process at SADC. And that is why it has melted away. And much more importantly, the noise around that whole process of attacking CCC and Chamisa exiting CCC has meant that the CM process and the illegitimacy and the Sham election, they belong to a totally different era. It's almost as if that never happened. There is not a single person in Zimbabwe today who is focused on that. And there's been a shift, a seismic shift, in my opinion, nationally and perhaps even regionally, from that illegitimacy and Sham election, which was obviously also overtaken by that one in the DRC as well. But there's been that shift to focusing on the implosion in the opposition movement. And in relation to the opposition movement, I want to say a few things. Number one, I've listened to the contributions that have been made by some of my colleagues there. And I would say one thing we always have to bear in mind is that if we look even regionally, there is no perfect democratic institutions in the other regional parties. Even in America, even in the Western world, democracy is always work in progress. Therefore, in my view, the diagnosis that the implosion in the opposition movement, including in Zimbabwe, has been primarily due to a democratic deficit. I don't think that's borne out by the evidence. I think clearly what is there is this: yes, institutionally, it's very important to have structures, to have a constitution, to have that framework, that framework of reference. But what is much more important than that is a culture, a democratic culture, and those two things are not necessarily contradictory. But in the Zimbabwean case, including in this cycle, it is really about infiltration by the state. I don't think, in my view, that had Chamisa had a robust constitution, which is democratic, he would have been able to keep out the infiltration that the regime engineered. I think clearly there is a connection, in my view, between even the extreme version of that constitution that we saw Chamisa submitting in the legal process and the absence of infiltration. There's that connection between that and ZANU-PF's behavior and the state's behavior. Chamisa and the democratic movement have been forced almost to adopt extreme measures just to remain relevant and successful and thriving in this environment. And I think the fact that we are all sitting here in agreement, in my view, that Sengezo Chabangu is an imposter and infiltrated. Actually, he wasn't able to infiltrate CCC. It was the state that facilitated that via compromised state institutions. The reason why that is so clear-cut in terms of that point of entry is essentially because of that absence, in my view, that is, of those conventional structures and a conventional constitution that we were talking about. So I think
so you agree then that these extreme measures, very unconventional measures of having a party without a structure, has failed. Has failed.
No, I don't agree. I think one thing I have to emphasize, because I think this is very important, I think I have to accept that for me, reputationally, it's important and necessary to have those conventional structures and constitutions. I think it's very important to have that democratic seal of approval. But I do not think that regardless of whether or not there are those structures and constitutions are.
You are muted at the moment.
I don't think it's possible to overcome the state's machinations in that context. One thing we have to bear in mind, and I must emphasize this point, is this: we are looking at a state. The current leadership in Zimbabwe came into power via a coup.
We can't hear you, Brighton.
Brighton.
Hello?
You're muted.
All right. I think there's a call that was trying to come through.
Let me just put a question to you.
Yes.
Does the movement have to throw up their arms and surrender in the face of an intervention state? Has used all kinds of tricks to muzzle and infiltrate the movement. What should the opposition movement do going forward? As a strategy, what would you recommend in the light of what's before us now? This total mess, if we call it that.
Well, that's the point I was coming down to, Professor. I wanted to highlight that we have to accept that in 2008, ZANU-PF lost power, but there was no transition to a new regime, and we have to emphasize that point. And I respectfully submit that even in 2018 and 2023, there are indications that the regime also lost power. Now, in terms of the current situation, I think we're dealing with an exceptional situation. It is, of course, understandable when there are failed transitions, including what we've seen recently, for the focus to shift from the state to the opposition. But essentially, I think at this moment in time, the current regime that we're dealing with is so exceptionally committed to thwarting democratic transition that there is hardly anything that the opposition can do currently in terms of conventional politics until perhaps there is a shift in the region, to democracy and upholding democratic values, as it were, and the CM processes that we're talking about.
Brighton, that the conduct of the state, the Zimbabwean state currently, is less a demonstration of strength than one reflection of weakness. Weakness, for that matter, fatal weakness. When you live in a world in which you regard the opposition as enemy,
yes,
and you, what do you always say, the dialectic, when you think you are very strong in terms of the repressive forces of the state, you're actually very fragile. Wouldn't you agree that we are in a stage in which the current state in Zimbabwe is actually very fragile and very vulnerable?
Well, my take on that is
both within itself and in relation to the popular forces outside it.
Well, my take on that is that the dangers, of course, of authoritarianism, as you saw even with Mugabe's, is that it can only last for so long, and it always tends to collapse from the center. And as we speak right now, we've got issues to do with lack of performance legitimacy. We're looking at your inflations, runaway inflation, look at the budget, the extreme taxation, and there's never going to be enough cake to go around. And I think that is the key in the end in terms of.
Sorry, you're muted again. You're muted again. You are muted again. Sorry, Brighton, you're muted. Brighton, can't hear you.
I'll shift to my laptop. I think I was on my mobile. I'll shift to my laptop if that's all right, Professor.
Okay. Maybe I'll come back to you while you organize yourself. I'll come back to you.
Yes, let me do that.
No,
don't
leave.
Yes.
Don't leave. I not be able to get you in.
Well, come on. Chennai, please. Chennai.
Hello, hi, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, maybe we'll take it from where Brighton stopped. We really want to know what's the way forward. We agree that.
Okay, so I think I have to position.
The crisis is less in the opposition than it's a crisis of the state in Zimbabwe, the crisis of politics in Zimbabwe. So how do we move forward?
Absolutely. So I will just quickly highlight the context to which I will provide my answer to you, Ibo, if that's okay. Because I think when we are throwing things into the mix in terms of what is wrong with the politics in Zimbabwe, we tend to ignore proportionality. So we may focus on a lot of things, most of which are right, but how much do they impact the current status quo, right? And for me, I think I would put in there my top 3 before we even design a way forward, is to actually say that we need to agree as a nation that we have a judiciary state capture that is absolute. And I would wish that platforms like SAPES can actually talk more about what we do to fix that, because that is our first and prime problem. Before we even decide who is doing what in opposition, we have a captured judiciary where I think Chipo was talking about us as citizens holding politicians to account. And one of the places that we would do that would be through the courts, right? But we don't have, Zimbabweans do not have that recourse. And so I feel like that should be of prime importance when we are talking about everything wrong with the politics in Zimbabwe. Another issue, again, is the thing around media and state interference in media and tools of media that, again, tend to shape a certain narrative that almost the opposition is nearly always on the back foot. Or any dissenting voices at that, even in civic society, we are always at the back foot because of the extent to which the state will control and reshape the narrative through the media. So that is another thing that we need to do. And I say this specifically in this arena because when we are looking at certain things that some people are seeing now, we are seeing some of the fallout of the opposition, but you've got to understand that for the people that have been on this journey in the trenches for a long time, these fallouts are not new. These characteristic traits are not new. They have been seen, they have been observed over time, and more so by the likes of people like Advocate Nelson Chamisa, who has been at it for nearly 3 decades now, I believe. So we might only be seeing the other side of whomever changing their working with Chabangu and doing all these kinds of things. We are only seeing it now, but that's not to say that it only happened now. Again, in terms of the civic society, we've got a very tender and sensitive civic society in Zimbabwe that has to constantly remember the role of the military, the way in which it influences, the way they engage, the way that, again, how it has an influence on the role that they play in terms of the political landscape in Zimbabwe. So these are some of the things that I think when we talk about political crisis in Zimbabwe, we've got to really allow and understand and not understate the impact of these three factors. So moving on from that, what does the opposition politics look like in Zimbabwe? Opposition politics in Zimbabwe has got to be adaptable. It's unfortunate that because we are not coming from a mature state in terms of our politics, Zimbabwean politics is, I would say, level 1 in the landscape of maturity. For instance, speaking to you, Professor, you are looking at sort of, should we have structures? What kind of constitution should we have? And really what has benchmarked our understanding of politics is the ruling party, is ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF have almost set the scene to say, when you set up an opposition party, you must do things this way. And we need to become a little bit more creative and a little bit more innovative in the way that we respond, and not necessarily adopt the same template that is the ZANU-PF template. Because once you do that, it transfers with it the ZANU-PF culture as well. And I believe now that we are seeing some of the ZANU-PF-isms coming through, some of whom would have been opposition politicians, and we are seeing some of those ZANU-PF-isms coming through, whether it's through character, traits, or even that mindset that says, well, you need to have 3 assemblies and women's assembly, youth assembly, and we have to have these things because that is the template that we know. But we must challenge ourselves to be a little bit more creative, a little bit more adaptable, not only to move with modern politics, but also to really create the politics that will inform the future of Zimbabwe. And for me, having experienced some of those traditional structures, I personally thought it was very problematic, especially having also experienced a different politics here in the West. I could never understand some of the roles that we had. It was quite bureaucratic, quite heavy in terms of trying to engage opposition politics. And for me, it came as a breath of fresh air to actually go towards a leaner structure, a structure that means that, and my view for the future is that we need to move towards something that is more theme focused, again, lean, because the thing that Chipo was highlighting of we have positionality is important. It's the thing that people say, okay, I'll join opposition because I would like a position. Why do they want that position? Probably it merits them favor within certain communities or certain arenas, which is the exact type of politics that we're trying to move away from. This is not the politics that we want a new Zimbabwe to have. So we need to be a lot more innovative, I think. I think we need to align ourselves towards value addition. So what is the thing that opposition politics needs to be focusing on that actually adds value to the Zimbabwean community? Is it around the pillars of, is it around deliverables, around economics, around the justice system, rather than we want a heavy structure with secretary generals and all this when we know we are not the type of people to necessarily be going to war at this point. So I would like us to imagine a very different type of politics in Zimbabwe. And what again we are seeing when I was sort of following the whole Chabangu and the recalling of the MPs, which is slightly similar to what we observed again in 2018, is we are seeing Mnangagwa now, post-2023 elections, creating something that actually minimizes the voice of the people through the National Assembly, through local council, where it's almost becoming ritualistic. It's like, okay, you are Scott Sakupwanya is a whole MP that nobody voted for, so it's kind of demeaning almost, and even I can't imagine that a lot of people out there actually necessarily even want to be opposition members of parliament anymore after what we are seeing. And really the orchestration of those recalls, to me, is a weakened and captured judiciary and state of law straight from the National House of Assembly into the courts. And so when that happens, we now need to be wise around how we view the role of members of parliament and councils. How important does that role become in our journey towards freedom? So, we need really to move away, I think, to really change and reposition our politics in opposition. And again, another thing I must address around personality. You know, this thing of because for us to move forward, we must have person A, person B, person C, person D. I completely, with all that I am, disagree with that positioning, because we can only engage with those that we feel are so moved towards the goals that we are all trying to reach, which is of a free Zimbabwe, and none of this kind of individualism around politics. Because in as much as someone might be talented, in as much as there might be a big name, right? This is not the Zimbabwe that we want. We are currently a Zimbabwe of big names, of, you know, we've Mugabe, Mnangagwa, whomever we've gone through from when I was a child. You know, we were singing the big names. So we need. Let me
go back to the question I raised with Brian.
Sorry, Prof, I can't hear you. You seem to be cutting off.
Are we distracted from the problem? Only
sorry, Ivo, I can barely hear you. Hardly.
Hello.
That's a bit better now, but yeah.
I was asking that, aren't we ignoring the central problem, immediate problem, namely what happened in August, a disputed election, from which all this that we're discussing, aren't we being distracted from tackling the main problem, a disputed election?
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is where I think the position that Nelson Chamisa has taken to separate himself and his positioning from what is happening through CCC and the courts, etc. It now allows him, I think, to refocus on the disputed election, because it appears to me, and I would agree with you there, that what the regime has been trying to do since is, because the by-elections and the recall started in September, almost straight away, within a month, we were in recall mode, and that has entertained us to date. And we keep getting all these small things coming through of disputes here, little fights there, but really, we must refocus on the legitimacy crisis that has arisen out of the 23 general election. And I hope that as Nelson Chamisa is now kind of relaunching his focus, because I've heard you use the word that his resignation, and I think from when I was reading that, I read that more as a move away from the institution and not an abandonment of kind of the purpose, you know? So I would hope that what that means in practical terms is that he can reposition his focus on 23 August. And I hope there will be others to come along with that, especially in the civic society space, because I personally feel that the role of civic society so far in Zimbabwean politics has been quite, you know, whether it's in the background, we need to see them more in the forefront, because things like a legitimacy crisis is a national issue, is a civic issue. And so that we should really refocus on that. And when we're doing that...
Chennai, the argument out there, not only in Zimbabwe, but outside in the region, is precisely the opposite, that the state has successfully overwhelmed Chamisa, and the Chamisa is now on a much weaker ground. And for example, people are asking now, if we are going to have a discussion over the transitional authority, who do we discuss with in the opposition? This is a big question.
Okay, so obviously,
I mean, unless you have other evidence there to show that Chamisa is refocusing, reinventing himself, it appears to us, to most people, that Chamisa is really on the back foot now, and that he's leveraging or his position vis-a-vis ZANU-PF in any proposed talks, or for that matter, transitional authority, is very weak on weak ground now, very weak.
Okay, so I mean, that's one position. Obviously, I can't comment on how popular a position that is. But when we are looking at the idea of a transitional authority, the basis of that is the general election, right? You're sort of saying, let's start from the basis of the fact that the general election was a sham election. So therefore, it makes sense that you would bring to the table those that were involved in the general election. So for me, that is that question, I think it answers itself by the very nature that is attempting to address the 23rd of August. And that is a point in time that resonates with certain characters that were at the table. So whatever that should look like, it should involve those players, right? In terms of where are we? Is the opposition leader Nelson Chamisa on any sort of back foot since, I don't know how many months has it been, 4 months since the general election? Then I would argue there that what we are actually seeing is a strengthening of the position of the observers from the general election, where they said there were a lot of things that pointed towards sort of a non-credible election. And we are seeing that again, and even worse, through the courts, with the barring of candidates at midnight before, on the eve of an election, with the continuous recalls, with the National Assembly has actually, it's brought itself into that equation as well. So actually, what this season is actually proven is, one, that Zimbabwe is not in a position to reform itself without external support and external interference. We cannot reform because the government of the day is going to continue to use the stresses that exist in terms of the judiciary capture, in terms of the captured state overall. So I would argue that instead, what is now on the back foot is legitimacy. What is now on the back foot is any logic that starts to say that ZANU-PF is strong, that ZANU-PF is trying to do the right thing. Like, that is out of the, it's not even in question anymore. We all know where we are. We are 99.9% authoritarian rule. And in terms of any reforms, it's clear that we need to start with institutional reform. We need to start with state institution reform before we can even begin to talk about any form of transition.
Yeah, well, that's begging the question: who does that? You have just said before that the Zimbabwean state is incapable of reform. So who does that? I'll come back to you on that question. Let me go now to Jackie Sunday. Jackie, my question again: aren't we focusing too much on the opposition instead of looking at the realities of 23rd of August, a failed election, and a state which is incapable of reform? Jackie? Is Jackie there? Jackie? Jackie's not there.
I'm here.
You heard my question. You heard my question?
Yes, I heard your question. That ain't we focusing too much on the opposition. I think the current problems that the nation face are two-pronged. Obviously, naturally, we are used to blaming ZANU-PF for all the problems that the country faces, which is well and good, because ZANU-PF has actually shaped the political discourse of the country since before independence. I've heard talk about the concept of a sellout. The concept of a sellout started pre-independence during the liberation struggle itself, which was a non-tolerance to anyone who is deemed to have sold out, with devastating consequences, and mainly it would lead to death. So that was an instant execution of anyone who is deemed to be a sellout. And that aspect of a sellout, because this was being done in the villages, where the liberation fighters were based or were housed or were hosted. This is a culture now that is in us, where if someone is not agreeing with you, then they are bound to be called or labeled a sellout. Now, this is said in that it actually tends to silence discourse and to silence good ideas. Because if your idea, no matter how good it is, and it is not directly supporting the whoever favorite politician or favorite officers' views, then no matter how good what you're saying is, it will not be taken because now you are labeled a sellout. So we should move away from idolizing individuals and critiquing ideas. And as Zimbabweans, we are so focused on one individual being a savior for the nation. Excuse the pun. One individual is seen as the one who's going to rescue Zimbabweans from all their problems. But that is not what. But what if that is not the case? What if it's supposed to be a joint effort and there's no one person who's particularly supposed to be that intelligent and that strong and that tough that they're going to outwit ZANU-PF and maneuver their way into power and save the nation? What if it's a joint effort? So anybody who is opposing that person who is seen as the possible potential or viable savior to the country who will save Zimbabwe from ZANU-PF, then it means they will not listen to you. And unfortunately, this also gets to the leaders. We saw this happening with Morgan Tsvangirai himself. I think it actually then gets to the leader themselves that I am the savior, that I am the hero, that I am the one. And they then let that get to their heads and silence any other contributions that may come from the people around them. And this is said because we're silencing good ideas, we're silencing brilliant solutions, which may actually propel the country forward. But as long as it has not been said by the person that is deemed to be a favorite, then that idea is as good as nothing. We need to move away from that. We need to move away from the concept of sellout and be able to debate issues and ideas and be able to criticize even those we deem to be our potential saviors or our favorite politicians. They need to be held to account. I've heard some of the contributions which have been made, and it has been difficult for some of Chamisa's colleagues or supporters to take responsibility. We need leadership that will take responsibility. We need leadership that will take responsibility when they are to blame or when something goes wrong. Let's look at the past elections that we have. The playing field was not level. The environment was not conducive enough for a democratic election to be held. For instance, to start with, one of the major candidates, Xavier Kasukwere, had just been disqualified all the way to the top court, the constitutional court, the apex court. They have been barred from participating. Do you call that a democratic election? Do you call that democracy when one person on flimsy, seemingly technical grounds is barred from participating in a democratic election? But if we were one people at that stage, everyone should have said, if this person is not allowed, then I will not participate. Because you may think that this hurdle is barring this particular candidate. It does not affect me. But guess what? 23 August, there were hurdles specifically for Nelson Chamisa and Triple C, where he is deemed to have majority support. What was happening? The chaos, the shambolic conduct of the elections on that day. Then even on that, even if you had said, okay, let me participate, perchance I'm going to win. At that point, what happened on the 23rd of August, one could say, I am pulling out. You don't need to wait for results of a shambolic, of a sham election. You don't need to wait for the results for you to declare that these results are irrelevant. They are improper, they're unconstitutional, they do not come or they are not derived from a constitutional process, from a democratic process, and therefore I will not validate this sham process by endorsing it, by participating in it. That did not happen. So there are missed goals, there are missed opportunities that could have maybe seen Zimbabwe's problem addressed in a more robust manner. And here we are now. So there was the SADC report.
Yes, Jackie, how do we reset to go back to the SADC report? How do we go about that?
I am afraid that that is water under the bridge. No matter how much we may try and appease our supporters to say, no, we can still hold on to SADC. Everything has got a timeline of survival. And especially in politics, you need to move swiftly. You need to be agile. Otherwise, that boat has sailed. I do not think as of now, because now we are dealing with an
You're saying that it's too late. You're saying it's too late to discuss.
I think I would want to say that as my personal opinion and analysis, I think that we cannot still say we are banking on SADC, because that golden opportunity presented by SADC, it only needed Nelson Chamisa to say that I am not recognizing this result, not after the results have been announced. I'm not recognizing the process because of the chaotic manner in which it has been conducted, because of non-compliance with legislation and democratic principles. I am not endorsing or I'm pulling out. And then that would have brought everyone to the table, including SADC. But at the moment, way after the general election, now we're looking at an internal process which is not does not have the benefit of oversight by international observers. This becomes an in-house issue, and people will be soon focusing on other regional elections which are taking place or which have taken place after the Zimbabwean election. So what we need in Zimbabwe as opposition leaders are people who are agile, people who act quickly. And also, I would want to go back to my colleagues who have been contributing and saying that no, there was justification for lack of structures in a party which wants to participate in democratic processes. Now, if you want to attack something, you have and promote. You're saying you are attacking the authoritarian rule of ZANU-PF, and we want to promote democratic principles in our country. And then you yourself do not want to practice those same democratic principles amongst yourselves. You want to exempt yourself from those, but still sell to people that, no, we are going to be better than ZANU-PF in such and such a way. Where is your constitution? There is no way you can embark on a game without outlining the rules in advance, because the failure to outline those rules in advance is what has led to this creature now they are crying about Chabangu. Chabangu came because there were no rules to the game. There was no constitution to guide who occupies which position. There was no procedure to appoint the leaders who were now holding office in various capacities. So that is why Chabangu could come. If a game of soccer has got no rules, even a spectator can come in and go and score a goal, and everyone says, yes, that's a proper goal, because there are no rules. But if you know that from the outset, this team has to have so many players, that team has to have so many players, and there has to be a referee, and there has to be a linesman assisting the referee, then that's chaos will not happen. So opposition has to look themselves and introspect and admit where they went wrong. But however, when you look at the political... Yes.
Thanks,
Okay.
Jackie. Towards the end. Let me go back to Brighton. Jackie has said that the window appears to be closed. The discussion of SIOM is past. It's water under the bridge. Do you agree to that?
Now, I have to begrudgingly and reluctantly accept that reality, Prof. I think essentially what we are looking at is what I highlighted earlier. The consistent and deliberate brutal attack on Chamisa and the CCC by the regime was specifically designed to take away CCC and Chamisa's agency in the SIOM SADC process. So once that falls away, it's then difficult, in line with what you highlighted earlier, to then find the basis upon which it can be argued that there is somebody who is got the local standi to appear before SADC and push through that process. I mean, in my view, that shouldn't be the case, because ultimately, the current crisis is a continuation of the unresolved matters from that sham election. So what that entails, I'm struggling with my voice because of that COVID situation, so bear with me. So what that entails is that it is the regime's primary focus to delegitimize a Chamisa that then arises outside of CC, say that he is too connected to that process, or a CCC that would want to push that process minus Chamisa. I mean, ultimately, what we've agreed earlier is that it is not just CC we're talking about. We're talking of the civic space as well. That's been destroyed. You know, we could have seen a coalition of political parties, civic organizations coming together, push through that process. But all of that has been ruthlessly crushed as well. So this is why it's important for me, for people not to get deceived and distracted by the regime's machinations. And I'll come back to what my colleague Jackie was saying. For the record, I want to emphasize that I subscribe to the notion that each and every political party that participates in elections and democratic processes has to have a sound constitution and sound structures which are clear-cut. That I must emphasize that point, but I must also go further and say it is important for Zimbabweans not to be deceived by the regime. I don't know if a lot of people know that currently, as the law stands in Zimbabwe, it is possible to run a political party without a constitution and without registering, and that voluntary or verbal agreements are lawful and legitimate and are recognized and are constitutional as well. Now, the reason why that's important is that Shabangu is a non-existent creature. We must highlight that point. He is fiction. There is no basis. I dare my colleague Jackie today wake up and say and appear before the courts and say that she had a position in CCC, or find someone, you know, a low-level person who claims to have a position in CCC, and see if she will succeed before the judiciary, and see if she will succeed before Parliament in whatever political steps that she's going to take in line with with the steps that Shabangu took. There is a clear convergence between the deliberate steps that Shabangu took and the political objectives of ED and his regime. That convergence should never be missed, and people should not be naive when it comes to that factor. You know, we're looking at a clear political objective. You're looking at your Scots coming into play. You're looking at the 2/3 majority coming into play. And it is downright naive to think that Shabangu could just come and exist and participate and create a platform for ED to increase his parliamentary tally, which then raises his 2/3 majority purely because of grievances.
Who's on ship tomorrow? Both of us.
Brighton, what's to be done? What's to be done? I mean, if you can just conclude, tell us what's to be done. Shall we give up, as you suggested, that Siom is water under the bridge? You also almost dismissed the idea of a broad coalition of opposition parties. What should be done?
I'll come to that, Prof. Now, I haven't dismissed a broad coalition of parties and prominent figures. What's important is the political values and objectives, you know, that guide any such political figures. And we know that at the moment we are in a season of high political drama in Zimbabwe. We've got certain political figures that are in play. I mean, we've got in the opposition, you've got your Professor Washman Nube, you've got your Charlton Wendes, you've got your Tendai Bitis as well. And now we are at a moment in time where there are clear fissures in the opposition movement. And my assessment of that situation is this. These people, or these political figures, have not fallen out because of a divergence in political ideology or values. It's been simply a question of egos. You know, that's what we've seen. Now, where you've got such competing egos, and that's the back to Morgan Tsvangirai's days as well, you're not going to achieve one of the political objectives that you want. So it's not just about quantity, it's about quality as well. So qualitatively, what have we got? Do we have political figures within the opposition movement and in the NGO sector as well, with the political grievance, the integrity, the commitment that's needed to see through this process? I think that's the key. Currently, there's no one, I think, that can deny that fact that the only authentic opposition voice that's there, which resonates with the grassroots, is Nelson Chamisa. Now, he's not going to be able to do that by himself. So what's important is that at this moment in time, there will have to be others who have to step up. We've got their credentials. I mean, there are political figures, I think, who are not controversial, like your likes of maybe, for instance, Advocate Matinenga, and those are people of high integrity, and those can come onto onto the political table and join. But I would say we should never give up. The regime itself, right now, a lot of people are not saying that, but the regime itself is clearly teetering at this moment in time. We've just come from the season of the gold mafia I highlighted earlier. At the moment, look at taxation, you look at runaway inflation, look at currently the currency. I mean, it's plummeting, and we clearly going back to the 2001 to sort of 8 situations in terms of hyperinflation. And there is clear, look at the Mpuzi interchange, nothing is happening there. So ultimately, in terms of the social fabric of the nation, we're talking about massive, migration, outward migration. In my field, literally every week, I'm dealing with Zimbabweans of all ages. You're not just talking of the young. You're talking of the young, the middle ages, etc., highly skilled people who are living jobs as well. And I will tell you this, Professor, I've got some of my colleagues that I went to uni with. They're highly educated, they've got families, and they've had a head start, but it's not happened over the past 2 decades. And they're complaining that their lives right now are the worst they've ever been. I'm dealing with some people from the security establishment who are moving to the UK to settle, and they speak in confidence. And they're highlighting that there is massive disgruntlement, including in the security sector. The salaries are absolutely horrid, and they're not enough to buy anything. We saw recently, I think there was an attempt to increase their salaries by $300. It was, portions of it were in Zim dollars and other portions were taxed. So I think the key point to highlight is this. Ultimately, this can only go for so long without an implosion. And when an implosion takes place, that will be too late. And that's also the picture that's not been picked up originally by the likes of your Ramaphosa's and regionally as well. So we should never give up. The definition
let's
not just
stop.
of kissing.
Let's stop, but then I'll come back to sum up at the end. Let me call in some of our participants. Tony Rila. Tony Rila. Tony.
Thank you. The phrase that comes to my head listening to this debate about opposition politics is snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. As we headed into this election and on this platform, we pointed out quite clearly, with all support from international experts, regional experts, and local experts, that this election could not possibly be free and fair. And so it was. And then what happened was that view was endorsed by SADC. SADC said categorically, this election is not free and fair. Ergo, the government is illegitimate. That's a really important statement. This is not some neat little thing where we go off to Tabo at Krut Constantia and have a little quiet cabal. They've said it's illegitimate. Now, they've not said very much since then because they've been waiting to hear what we think about illegitimacy. And this is the failure of opposition politics. Not just the failure of opposition politics, it's the failure of civil society. So in the interregnum, since the election and where we are now, nobody has proffered a solution to the problem. ZANU-PF says we'll govern, and the consequence of illegitimacy is they have been accepted as de facto, but they're not de jure. They don't recognize that they are legally elected. Where are the statements from the political leaders in the opposition? Where are the statements from civil society? Where are the statements from the churches to say, we accept your view? And if we accept your view, what is the solution? Now, SADC, I believe, and all evidence suggests, that SADC is waiting to hear from Zimbabwe. What is the solution? And we know what the solution from ZANU-PF is. De facto will morph inevitably into de jure, as it always has, because there's no other alternative position. And what's the alternative position? Well, the alternative position was put in January 2023 by Ibo and myself. We said it's a Lancaster House moment. It requires political settlement, national dialogue, and a transitional arrangement leading to new elections. That's a very clear statement. And our understanding is that's been widely accepted around the region as being an intelligent response to the crisis. But nobody in this whole discussion I have heard has said, where is the position that we as Zimbabweans, opposition political parties, the churches, civil society, labor, the citizens who actually are completely oblivious to any of these discussions, who is saying there is another way? I haven't heard another way except, reform the politics. Let's think about whether this leader or that leader will be much better for us. Where's the position that we take to the nation and we take to the region, to the continent and the international community? I'm depressed out of my brain. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we'll go back now. Hopewell, there's a question raised by Tony. What do you say to that, Hopewell?
Thank you, Prof. Please, can you repeat the question for me?
Well, Tony is saying that there's been no coherent statement from the opposition parties about the SADC report, about what should be done, what is the solution. It's almost as if the disputed election, the failed election is a fait accompli, and that you have, in fact, a de facto government, which may become de jure, if also because of the lethargy on the part of the opposition parties.
That is indeed.
The question, therefore, is that a correct characterization? And if so, what can be done about it?
Thank you, Prof. I think what Dr. Ryler said there is correct, because the main protagonist is the opposition, which is CCC. And what needed to have been done was to push. I think I've been saying this so many times, getting insults, that in order for the region to take us seriously, we have to engage. You and I know very well that to start with, the level of engagement that was taking place was not seen as serious by the region itself. you and I know that they were complaining about the they were basically saying that the opposition in Zimbabwe is not taking this seriously because of the people that they are sending to engage with us. And we raised these issues privately, you know that, Professor Mandaza, but they were not taken on board. Secondly, I'm sorry to say this, but this is the reality. I think the region is not coming back to Zimbabwe until Zimbabwe or Zimbabweans and the opposition create a crisis in Zimbabwe that requires the region to pay attention to what happened, the crime scene of 2023. That election was not just rigged, it was so shambolic and despicable. People were waiting in lines until 2, 3, 4, 5 a.m. without voting. And, you know, a couple of senior political elites in the region have been asking me as far back as Saturday, what is Nelson Chamisa going to do now? Does this mean that's the end of the 2023? And I've mentioned this on social media to say we are being distracted by all this other stuff that is happening because ZANU-PF wants us to forget about 2023. And once we forget about 2023, we go into the de jure aspect that Tony Raila was talking about. Zimbabwe is going to be the chairperson of SADC. Is this going to be stopped? How are you going to stop it? But like a very senior political actor in the region said to me last week, Friday, he said to me, unless you create a crisis in Zimbabwe, nothing is going to change. And that crisis can only be created by a united entity. That is the opposition, civil society. We don't have to each other, Professor Mandaza. What we need to put ahead of anything else is national interest. What is the national interest in as far as the opposition is concerned? Can we transcend political personalities and go into national interest and say, if we need to bring back the SADC team and the SADC region to pay attention to 2023 and the shambolic election, we need to work together. It's unfortunate that a lot of people actually encourage these divisions that are taking place in the opposition by saying so-and-so is a sellout. You know, 2 years ago, I was in New York addressing a group of Zimbabweans. I got a phone call from Advocate Nelson Chamisa. One thing that I remember from that phone call is he said to me, there are two people, Hopewell, that I know that regardless of what happens, they will never sell out. It's Tendai Biti and Chibaya. Those two people will never sell out. And I agree with him. I find it despicable when people when people go into a disagreement and then we call each other sellout. I don't think Tendai is a sellout. I think there's a problem within CCC that they must resolve. Because as I said, the main ingredient in getting the 2023 issue resolved, it's Nelson Chamisa and CCC. So I think we should strive to make sure that these people fix whatever problems are there in order for the national interest to be addressed. And that national interest goes back to 2023. If that thing is not addressed in the next 2-3 months, I can tell you we might as well forget and go to 2028. And the same thing will be repeated again, unfortunately.
No? It's fine, I'll do it.
No. Thanks, Hope. Thanks very much. Thank you. Let me move on to Chipo. Your last word. I believe you're upset I cut you in the middle of your argument. Maybe you want to come back to that? Chipo?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you for having me again. I think my takeaway from this is that people should not be too disheartened by the factionalism, only because I think it is in the nature of opposition after fighting for 2 decades, now maybe close to 3 decades. The people that founded MDC in 1999 and the people that supported them are very different from what the majority voter looks like. So a lot of these conversations that we have about opposition politics and who's supporting them, I think sometimes we miss the fact that the majority of voters weren't born in 1999, or if they are my age, we were children in 1999 and could not vote and didn't know anything about politics. And now we are the adults. And those that are younger than me, this is the majority of voters. So when we talk about Zimbabwean politics, when we talk about engaging citizens, we're really talking about engaging a generation that has no historical memory of the opposition. Their memory of the opposition starts in the last decade. So for somebody who knows the opposition in the last decade, it's really hard to convince them without doing it properly that the opposition is the way forward, that continuing in politics is the way forward, because they've spent their entire childhood seeing a country that is fragmented, seeing an opposition that's continuously brutalized and losing elections and suffering from stolen elections. So that's one. How we engage and think about the citizen has to change. And that's critical, right? That's the job of all opposition leaders. That's the job of thinkers, of journalists, of academics, myself, yourself. That's our job. The next thing is that the opposition factions, as we see them, I don't think Nelson Chamisa is gone. I do think that there's going to be an opportunity in the next couple of weeks for the leaders that are vying for positions in the CCC, for leaders that are vying for positions elsewhere, and we might even see new characters. And when those people come up, I would hope that we use platforms like SAPIS to bring them to the table and ask them serious questions. I think that should be the job of public platforms going forward, where Zimbabwean politicians are brought to task, and you've always done this, but I think we need to do it more systematically, where they answer questions, where they are not treated with kid gloves by journalists that are asking questions with no follow-ups. But I do think they need to be on platforms like this, so that as citizens, we really get to understand their thinking and their ideology. And finally, I hate to say this, but I think when we talk about a transitional authority, the first question we should be asking ourselves, is this something that the military will allow? And how we answer that question determines how we move forward. Zimbabwe is a militarized state. So we cannot talk about transitional authorities, about new elections, even about how we engage SADC without asking our questions. How do we handle the question of the military? And then finally, I do want, because there's so many Zimbabweans who are going to be listening to this, I think Zimbabweans should not feel sad or disappointed or disengaged from politics, because we as citizens, not as an academic, but we as citizens are the most important actors. And I think we forget this sometimes because politicians make it seem as though they are the most important actors, but we are the most important actors in our communities. When we vote, and if people are going to go and vote on Saturday, you have to remember that you are the most important actors in Zimbabwean politics. Thank you.
Thanks, Chipo. Thanks very much indeed. Chennai, your last word. Please also deal with Tony really has thrown the gauntlet at not only at opposition parties, but to all of us, civic society included. What's your response in concluding?
Okay, I'll just say a few high-level points just to conclude this very important discussion. I think first and foremost, as a people, we need to choose our heart. We need to choose what is the thing that we need to focus most on at this juncture. Is the fight in opposition between Tendai Biti and Welshman and another the most important? Or is the captured situation of our judiciary state the most important? And for me, I think we need to come together to come up with solutions and ways forward that we can address what is happening and being allowed to happen through the courts. Because essentially, this transcends not just the politics, not just what is happening in CCC, but it has the potential, and I believe is already impacting us in terms of business investments. There's a commercial impact. In terms of the socioeconomics of the country, you know, at the moment, we are actually at the peak of a cholera crisis. And we've not really seen the elements of an emergency state that we should be seeing. There's hardly any information in the public domain with regards to cholera, which is important in mitigating it. And these are things that we should have easily by now been able to say, right, you know, is it section 62 of our constitution says this? Therefore, let's appear before the courts and put it to the Ministry of Health that this is what we want to know as citizens. But we can't do that because most will say it's futile. It just depends, you know, what side of the bed the courts wake up on that day. So for me, this is quintessential, and we must address this before we can even start to think about fresh elections or transitional authorities or this, that, and the other. This is the biggest problem we face today. In terms of opposition, I challenge the opposition and the opposition leadership that I think we all unanimously agree is some form of Nelson Chamisa, to work towards an overhaul, a completely innovative situation. Unfortunately, when we have these discussions, we seem to naturally look backwards and say, okay, we need structures, we need a constitution. But we go to 2018. Here we are with an MDC alliance, with a structure, with a constitution, still facing the battle that the CCC of today is facing, of the recalls, of somebody like Douglas Monzora being told he's now in charge, in ways that, you know, I would like to think logic always goes before even the law. It's completely illogical and should not have been allowed to pass through the courts. So we need to continue to innovate and to accept those innovations, especially, I speak especially to academics, to the political scientists and other academics amongst us, that as we map, as we look at how can we structure opposition in a way that is innovative, in a way that addresses the existing challenges, because we have to remain cognizant of those. In terms of resolving the legitimacy crisis, I think this again needs to come to the fore of our discussions. It needs to come to the fore of opposition politics and civic society. Where do we start from? Who is the best placed in civic society to begin to roadmap ourselves towards legitimacy? Because we can't just afford to wait for the next general election in 2028 without certain things having been reformed in the way that we run elections as a country. And perhaps, you know, the regional elements are right to say that this solution must start from Zimbabwe. And these are the things that we need to start congregating to discuss and mapping a way forward, a concrete way forward that we can say, on this day, we got together around a table and we shouted at each other. We might not have liked each other even, but we came up with a solution in the form of a roadmap towards legitimacy. Because that is what we need. Then there's been a word that people have, and here I speak really from a personal perspective around the idea of sellouts. And it's important. It's an important discussion. You know, people say, oh, you're a sellout. What does that mean for Zimbabweans? Generally for Zimbabweans, what that means is your goals have become misaligned to the democracy agenda. And we should never be silenced from calling those out. And you will find that people will call those out, obviously dependent, you know, I might be novice at doing so, but from my lens, where I feel that there's that fundamental misalignment between an individual's objectives and the democracy objective, we must never shy out of calling it out, and perhaps that gives that person an opportunity to look on and reflect. So I think I've answered your question, Ibo. I might have forgotten it, so do remind me if I haven't.
No, it's all right. Thanks, Chennai. Thanks very much. Jackie, your last word? Jackie?
Yes.
Your last word?
I'd want to say that the crisis in Zimbabwe, for sure, is not a one-man band, and we should not expect the solution to come from one individual. And any notion that believes that the solution will come from one individual is misguided. We need to have a convergence of ideas, a convergence of leaders who sit down and map the way forward for the country. Otherwise, if we still believe that is one person who is going to do it and any other person who wants to stand up and be counted in this process is a sellout, then we are not ready for democracy. And I would like to emphasize that the concept of sellout, I think it's high time we got rid of it. I do not think it has got any place in a democracy. People should be allowed to change their views, to support whichever leader they want. And it does not mean that to promote democracy in Zimbabwe, I have to support Chamisa. To promote democracy in Zimbabwe, I have to belong to CCC. I can love democracy. I can love development of my country without belonging to a certain party. So we should be able to accommodate as many voices as possible to converge as Zimbabweans and talk about how to make how to bring this country out of the quagmire it is in, out of the mess it is in, to bring it forward, to try and develop it. Because right now, ZANU-PF is only focused on maintaining power. And this has gone, the situation has gotten worse after the 2017 coup. You find that what happened in 2023, August 2023, is unprecedented. The way they are
Hey, Jackie, what happened? Jackie. Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Jackie, if you can hear us. Brighton, the last word, taking into account Tony's gauntlet.
Thank you, Prof. Just quickly, I want to highlight that Tony spoke about SADC and Zimbabweans coming together to push through that process to usher in change. Now, at the very height, at the very moment when there needed to be a coalition of organizations, etc., speaking with one powerful voice, there was a sudden and catastrophic collapse, which arose, in my view, from a combination of two things. Number one, infiltration by the regime. Infiltration by the regime means that it is 10 steps ahead. It's on the table when strategies are being discussed to respond to such crises. So that's the very reason why, in my view, at that particular moment when we needed to kick on with that CM process, it suddenly collapsed, because that's the very moment the regime was able to move forward with pushing through the Chabangu records, etc. Number two, I spoke about egos. I agree with Jackie to some extent that terms such as sellout are perhaps, those labels are perhaps not progressive, but they cannot be used to avoid calling out retrogressive individual and politics, which stands in the way of true unity. I mean, I'll give an example. At this moment in time, we saw that there was the Chabangu season. During the Chabangu season, or Chabangu reign of terror, we had Professor Washman Ngube, we had Tendai Biti that Hopo spoke about, we had Charlton Wende. Not a single one of them, not any single person amongst them stood out to castigate Chabangu, stood out in defense of their party as an ideal, politically. And I think it would be fair to criticize such splitters' behavior. And why that's important in our pursuit of the wider goal is that now, a few weeks later, a few months later, they're all coming out to claim ownership and leadership of the very organization that they were shying away from defending. And that's a matter of principle. And as long as that kind of behavior persists, it should be criticized and it should be recognized as a retrogressive step. Now, moving forward, yes, I subscribe to the fact that unity is needed, but not at all costs. It has to be unity amongst the principled, willing to ensure that the national interest is respected and observed. And that's going to take quite some time. The regime is committed to power retention and power retention by all means necessary. And until such a time, in my view, there's blood on the floor that dramatizes, disgruntlement with what's happened. It's going to be difficult for SADC to take any interest in Zimbabwe. We've seen in South Africa that we've seen how they came together and participated in, the Israel crisis, Middle East crisis, Palestine crisis, went over to the ICJ and that sort of thing. And so that shows me that if we come together and dramatize the situation, there can be sufficient traction to resolve the Zimbabwean question on the international platform, but we are so very far removed from that at the moment. I think in the next coming few weeks, we will have perhaps the job seeker situation sort of providing clarity in terms of his way forward. Is going to be whether or not he becomes an important player. I think the CCC infighting, I think that's a dead political horse. It's not going anywhere, that one, but we're going to see. But the regime is heavily invested in that, pursuant to trying to ensure that it kills that political objective of bringing unity and having a coalition that pushes through and changes our body politic and brings a new era of democracy and progression of our country. Thank you.
Thanks, Brighton. On that note, I would like to just conclude by saying that, well, I think Tony Rila put a very poignant point on the table, that really we seem to have forgotten August 23rd and the drama around it. More important, we seem to be distracted from confronting the SIOM report, even as we know, if you didn't know, that the region, SADC, is still seized with the SIOM report. And I'm most disappointed that there has not been the kind of response, the kind of agency from Zimbabwean political parties, civic society, churches, and so on. It's really terrible. Moving around the regions, the people are saying, what's going on in Zimbabwe? And here we are discussing opposition politics. And we thought it was very important to inject into the discussion the issue of legitimacy, the reality of a failed election, and the extent to which the state has sought almost successfully to distract the opposition itself from complaining and taking forward the SIOM report. So we'll leave it at that. We'll come back to this subject again, surely. And the challenge that Chennai has put to us, we need to address this problem in the opposition politics in civic society. On that note, I'd like to thank everybody, Hopewell, Brighton, Chennai, Chipo, and Jackie. I'm sorry that we was apologized that somehow Zoom shortchanged us. I thought it had been resolved, but it hasn't. When we began Zoom 2 years ago, we had a limit of 500. For some reason, it has just been dropped to 100. So many people, including people like Jilas Mawarire, couldn't get in. Blessed Mushlanga couldn't get in. And many others have been complaining. We apologize sincerely for that. And also just to tell you that the YouTube will be out, and we'll send it out to all of you tomorrow, so that you can at least have a record of all the discussion today. Again, thanks. And Brighton, I hope you recover from your COVID. Yeah, we need you. Thanks, everybody, and bye-bye.